So without further ado, here's Mike.
Thank you. The subtitle of my talk was The Modern History of Gaslamp Quarter, according to me. So many of you may have different impressions, have different stories, but bear with me. And it wasn't always this way. 2 weeks ago, there were 100 and some thousand people wandering around the quarter for Comic-Con, seeing the restaurants and the events and all the things that were going on. And that wasn't the way during my first encounter with the Gaslamp Quarter. I was in the U.S. Navy. I had transferred down here. My wife was still up in San Francisco. And the person I was sharing the room with at the Bachelor Officers Quarter said, let's go downtown and see what we can see. So we took a bus from 32nd Street and came down here. And it was interesting. This was a Navy town. North of Broadway had a lot of stuff. It had the Marston store and it had Walker Scott and the theaters. Many of the theaters were still operating. Broadway South was a whole different story. It was Navy town. And there were adult bookstores, massage parlors, go-go parlors, and locker clubs. I don't know if you remember what locker clubs were, but locker clubs in the Navy, when I was in the Navy, sailors were not allowed to have civilian clothes on ships. So they kept their civilian clothes in a locker in an establishment in Gaslamp. And the base closed at midnight. So if you didn't make it back by midnight, you rent a bunk in the locker club, leave your clothes, get in your uniform early in the morning, and come back out to the ship. It was a whole different atmosphere down here, and it was very interesting to walk around and see this. I was not very impressed. I was not very impressed with downtown San Diego. I'm from Chicago, and I came out here as a sailor, and this wasn't quite the same as downtown Chicago. But it grew on me, and after I got out of the Navy, I went back to Chicago to work for 3 years, and then my wife and I came back out here because it still snowed in the Midwest, and we wanted to get away from that. And one of my first assignments when I was here, I went to work for the planning department, and one of my first assignments was to work on design guidelines for Old San Diego. And one of the things that was given to me was a copy of a San Diego magazine. I try not to trip over the wires. A copy of a San Diego magazine that was printed in about the mid-1960s. And San Diego was getting ready for its bicentennial, which was 1969. And Ed Sulf, who was the publisher of San Diego magazine at the time, was trying to promote the events that would occur, or should occur, as part of the celebration of the bicentennial. So he commissioned a graphic artist who was down here, named Robert Hostak, to do some proposals. And one proposal was how to redevelop and revitalize Old San Diego, which was moving along, but not very well. And that was to represent the first century of the European settlements in San Diego. The second century was to be represented by restoration of the Gaslamp Quarter. In the third century, the future was to be represented by a proposal for how San Diego could develop in the 20th century, late 20th century, and the early 21st century. Because of just the politics and other things, the decision was made by the city council and others that only Old San Diego would be looked at. This was a write-off. This was downtown was not quite anything they wanted to get involved with at the time. But seeing that article and looking at it, it planted some seeds about, well, maybe we should begin to look at other things. About a year or two later, a retired Marine who lived in one of the single-room occupancy hotels down here, oh God, I forgot his name, Ed Scott, was a history buff, and he started writing about what was here, the historic buildings that were down in San Diego, and that we did have a past and a very important past. And he proposed a historic district that included everything sort of north of Market Street along 5th, as well as the Balboa Theater, the Golden West Hotel, the Spreckles Theater, and Horton Plaza, the park. And it again stimulated some interest. Tom Hom, who was a former city councilman, was really the person who led the charge. he came forward with a petition from the property owners to the city council saying that we want something done down here. We have something that's valuable. He pointed to examples of other historic districts around the country, in St. Louis, in Seattle, in other places, and said, why can't we do that in San Diego? At the time, the city code said that if a majority of property owners came forward with a petition, that the city would work with them to do something to help revitalize the neighborhood. After the Gaslamp served the petitions, the city council changed the ordinance. I'm sorry. But things moved along. Pete Wilson was elected mayor in 1971, and he ran on a plank that he was going to revitalize downtown. He was going to make that the center, he was going to manage growth, and he was going to, again, make downtown perhaps what it never was, but that would be something more than what it was at the time. Things had moved out. The department stores had closed. A lot of the area around Gaslamp Quarter had become parking lots, and there wasn't a lot here. But he made that a pledge that we would do something about it. It was an interesting process, and these are my stories, so bear with me. The city formed the Gaslamp Quarter Association, or the Planning Committee, whatever it was called at the time, and it was an interesting group of people. And we would meet in the upstairs of what was then a bank building on 5th and E, is now where the classic cars are sold. And it had we had a very diverse group of all the property owners representing different interests. We had the people who represented the social service agencies. We had absentee property owners who owned property and were renting for whatever they could. And we had a large contingent of the adult entertainment business. And they were the dominant party. And one day, there were people who would come to the meetings, and I always talk about this one man who would come with a couple of associates to a meeting. And he would exchange pleasantries at the beginning of the meeting, never say a word during the meeting. After the meeting, he'd exchange pleasantries and say, we'll see you next time. And he and his associates would go home. We were arguing about sign control and some of the design guidelines and some of the uses. And we had some people from the adult entertainment industry saying, we don't want any of those regulations. We had one guy who used to emphasize that with his push-button knife, and my boss and I decided we weren't going to disagree. And until one day we were discussing some of these things with sign control, and somebody slapped their hand on the table, and everybody shut up. It was one of the associates of this guy who never said anything. And he said, Mr. So-and-so wants to speak. And this gentleman said, I own some property in Old Town. I have a sign control, and I like it down there. We're going to have sign control here, and we're going to have design guidelines. After that, the adult entertainment business just, whatever we said, voted yes. It takes a lot of people and a lot of different interests to really cause something like this to happen. We started moving forward, working with the group, and the city council said, move forward, do something, and they gave us $100,000. $100,000 wasn't much in those days either. And they told us to go start a loan program, to do street improvements, to form a business improvement district, and do some other things. We knew that we weren't going to do any of that for $100,000. So what we did, we hired Robert Hostak, the person who had done the article for San Diego Magazine, to design a poster. I don't know if any of these are still around in the Gaslamp building.
We have.
Do you? I want to pass it around anyway, but you'll have to come get it, Catalina, because I can't. I'll screw up the taping. It was our vision for the area, and it was a way of encapsulating the things we wanted to do. We also built a model. And CCDC had the model before they closed, but it was a model of how we would restore at least one block of buildings in the Gaslamp Quarter. What we were able to do, though, with this is to leverage it into grants and other monies, gas tax money, federal grants, and other things to at least allow us to get started with some of the things we wanted to do. The district was beginning to change anyway. We had a lot of artists who, like canaries in the mine, were living in some of these buildings and doing their work because the rents were next to nothing. The upstairs, if they could get somebody to keep the lights on upstairs, the owners were happy. So we started working with the contingent of artists that were here, who unfortunately have all got priced out and moved to East Village where the school is, and now they're getting priced out of that, and they move, which is sort of the standard process. One of the things that I think we found when we looked at that, and we went around and looked at some of the other districts, was that while Old Town we got away with just some design guidelines and a couple of simple street improvements, it was going to take a lot more here. It was not going to be easy. It was not going to be something that a set of design guidelines, as good as they were not going to suddenly entice people to come down here and redevelop their properties or to change the uses. And putting in street improvements without having all that was not going to really change the area as well. It was a challenge. We had to find more tools and more resources, some of which are talked about in there, but others that weren't here. One of the things we did, unfortunately, I think, the original graphics for this and the ones in San Diego Magazine, the name of the district was not the Gaslamp Quarter. The name of the district was the Stingaree, which is the historic name of the district. And a lot of people felt, because of the history of the Stingaree and because of what was here 100 years ago, they felt people would not come down here to visit and to participate. So the Gaslamp Quarter name was chosen. As far as we know, there were never any gas lamps in the Gaslamp district. But that doesn't make any difference. I'm trying to find where I lost my place. One of the first buildings that was restored down here as the district was getting going was the Buell Town building on the 5th and, I want to say J, I think, if I got it right, to the spaghetti factory. One of the things that told us was that people would come down for a cheap plate of spaghetti and come not to the Gaslamp. They came to the waterfront. Nobody would say they would go downtown at night for anything. And so it was marketed as adjacent to the waterfront. We had an identity problem here, and that was, again, trying to change the image of what was down here so people didn't think of it only as the red light district. In order to maintain to get the momentum going and have a vital place that we wanted to see, we really had to find a lot of different tools, and it's always a work in progress. And I think one of the things that building a community like this is like building a personal relationship. You've got to work at it continuously. That's for any part of a city. You have to work at it continuously in order to be successful, just like you do with a personal relationship. This place will never be finished, nor will the city ever be finished growing. It's always going to be growing and changing because that's just the way it is. Some of the tools we came up with were short-term uses. Some were long-term. Some that we threw away because they didn't work down here. Many, and I'll get to some of those, have been taken over and really expanded and used in a lot of different areas in the city and around the country. We were a model. The Main Street program by the National Historic Trust And we are a Main Street city, and I think we have 20-some Main Streets. I may have the numbers wrong, but in the city of San Diego. This was the pilot project. We were not eligible to be a Main Street, but this is where they tested a lot of their ideas about business improvement districts, assessment districts, other things. They would ask us to try this, try that, and we did, because it was a way of seeing what worked. And I would like to give a few examples. One of the first things was, how do we get incentives? How do we get people to go and start doing something? So we started a competition, and we said that the first 2 blocks that came forward with a petition and plans from all the property owners about how they would redevelop their property, we would provide some loans, and we would do the street improvements. The first block at the north was where the Keating Hotel is. The first block in the south is where the Grand Pacific Hotel is. And those were the 2 pilot projects, one at either end, to show that this can, in fact work. We also did some things with recognizing that, and everybody still talks about it, is that these were old unreinforced masonry buildings. That they, because they were built without the steel reinforcing that we require today, that in case of an earthquake, the feeling was that everything would just fall over. And the city was very, very adamant about bringing these buildings up to code. But the state was also working on a historic building code. And we became part of the state process to look at how the historic building code could be applied to older buildings. That even though it didn't meet modern codes, there was some value and some structural integrity to many of the buildings down here. They had withstood a lot of things. So to take these buildings and try to bring them up to modern codes was not really the most practical thing we could do. We also found that the modern building codes were written at a time, the 1949 Housing Act of federal government was designed to discourage the rehabilitation of older buildings for social reasons. Older buildings were places where poverty and crime occurred, at least that was the philosophy at the time. So the best thing to do is wipe out all these older areas. That was one of the premises of urban renewal, which also got into racial issues. But we looked at the historic building code and to try to see how we could modify the codes. And we were one of the first cities to do that, to modify the historic building, the codes to account for historic buildings. One of the things we did was we held a national conference here that was funded by the American Academy of Science to look at the codes and go through all sorts of presentations and discussions to really develop a case for changing the building code. One of the interesting little side stories on that, two actually. One was the people that were involved in the planning and some of the speakers decided, and we were at the Westgate Hotel, decided one night we should go down and look at these buildings and see what the real issue was. So I had a group of about 10 men, and we were wandering down Fifth Avenue, and all of a sudden 2 police cars pulled up with their lights flashing. And they wanted to know what we were doing there. And the first thought was we were looking for prostitutes. And I explained who we were, what we were doing, and they said, well, it isn't safe for you to be down here. So they escorted us back to the Westgate. And that was sort of the attitude at the time. Just another side story on that. I'm an architect. I have a license from the state of California. And as part of that licensing process, you go through and you take a week's worth, at that time, a week's worth of exams. And then you go meet with a panel of examiners, and they ask you questions about things related to building construction and other things. And I went up there, it was in San Francisco at some airport hotel, and I went up there to take my oral exam. And I brought some drawings, and I brought this book that we had published about historic buildings, and I started talking about it, but they got into very technical questions. And I wasn't quite sure I was able to answer them correctly, and all of a sudden they switched gears. And they said, the Gaslamp Quarter. Some guy said, I'm coming down here next week. Can you recommend some restaurants? And so they all got into that, and I recommended some places probably no longer exist. And I left there thinking, I failed. I'm not going to get a license in California. And a few weeks later, it came in the mail. I mean, I made the right choice about which restaurants to recommend. But it takes some of those. We also looked at single-room occupancy hotels. A lot of the older buildings were single-room occupancy hotels where people on fixed incomes, low incomes, lived, and they shared bathrooms and kitchens. And they had a small room. And they were not considered safe and sanitary, and they were outlawed by codes many years before this all started. The Grand Pacific Hotel was bought by two women who were from Rancho Santa Fe. They're realtors. And they wanted to try something different. They put a restaurant on the ground floor, did some restoration work, and the idea behind the restaurant was to keep the rents low enough to subsidize people living upstairs. It was an experiment. It was also one of those things that really forced the city to start looking at how to find places for people who are on fixed incomes who are at the poverty level. And that led to the redesign or the reinvention of the single occupancy hotel. And that was something that, again, grew out of the Gaslamp Quarter. The first ones were the Baltic Inn, that's on 6th Avenue, and now there's many, not enough perhaps, but many. And again, it was one of those experiments that was started by this district and then was carried on throughout. The street improvements, again, were all beyond the city standards. The brick pavers that went in, the street lights that were designed to try to imitate the street lights that were here historically, although the bulbs and the globes are in a different direction than they were originally. But again, codes changed and we had to change with it. Planting street trees, which were never here. And because it was above the city standards, how do you pay for the maintenance of this? And the maintenance district was formed. But one of the things that we did here that was part of the process was try to find a way of doing it less expensively. And part of that was who we hired to do the maintenance. And the maintenance was managed by the Park and Rec Department, which at that time managed the assessment districts. But we hired the homeless to train them. And the city has just gotten back into doing something like that 25, 30 years later. But we hired homeless, and we had a day center, which was on 6th Avenue, it's now a nightclub, where people could leave their gear during the day, maybe get some counseling, maybe get a place to stay out of the rain if that was the case. And it was run by the Episcopal Community Services. At night, we had somebody who had a motel up on Cortez Hill, who was the place where these people could go at night. That was Father Joe. And Father Joe villages started with the Gaslamp Quarter. And the Alpha Project started again with the day center in the Gaslamp Quarter. So the things that we were experimenting with got adopted by others. We ended up not using the homeless continuously for street cleaning because we were trying to do things less expensively, all by hand. And we had two problems. One is machinery does it much better than by hand. And number two, whenever we got somebody that was really trained to operate the machinery or to lead a crew, they got hired by a maintenance company, and we were constantly in a training mode, and that was not really what we wanted to do. But again, it was one of those things that came out of the Gaslamp Quarter that was an experiment, a short-term tool, and then something that moved on to something else. A lot of blank walls. And I think you asked me for some photos, they're all in the basement of the building. Mural project. What do we do with the blank walls? How do we begin to do something? A lot of them had advertising at one time or another that was painted on there. We have a sign ordinance, and we had a lot of issues about repainting some of those signs. So the decision was to make a competition for murals. I think there was a half a dozen murals that went up. We had a selection committee. We had an artist who was running the program, and we put up the murals. And we have an annual Onions and Orchids program, and I got an onion for the mural program. I mean, it was all part of the game. But one of the other things that came out of it was the city saying, maybe we should be thinking about this seriously. Maybe there's a role for public art in this whole process. And that what is now the Commission for Arts and Culture came out of the mural project in the Gaslamp Quarter. Stop me if you have any. I'm just remembering all these things, writing them down. Many events take place here. The association puts on all sorts of things on St. Patrick's Day and Cinco de Mayo and every other holiday. That was something that, again, was started many years ago to try to, again, bring people down here. The first event was one that was held, I think, between the railroad tracks and maybe Jay, 1 block or 2 block event. We did the food preparation in the rescue mission, which was on 5th Avenue. We had musical entertainment by the PD5. I don't know if the PD5 still exists, but the police department had a band. And you could get them for next to nothing to come down and play. And that was the first event that was held down here, and the streets were closed, and we tried to bring people down to see the district. It was, again, it was a constant marketing tool to see what was going on. And the second event was held, the house had already been put in place, and it was the 100th anniversary of transit in San Diego. And the Gaslamp Association partnered with the Metropolitan Transportation System, MTS, and they brought the San Diego Symphony down to play on the streets, and that really got things started. That people said that you can come down here and there's things going on, and how we should really market this area. But we also looked at, and I think this is really the association also looked at other things that needed to be done or should be done to try to enliven the district, but also to recognize who was here. That you had older people on fixed incomes, you had people going to restaurants, but you had families even down here, and families living in the surrounding area. And so we put on Christmas in the Gaslamp Quarter. I played Santa Claus 1 or 2 years, but other people played Santa Claus and gathered a lot of toys. Bud Fisher, who restored a lot of buildings here, also had a toy market, I guess, every year. And he donated a lot of toys, and we had kids come sit on the laps and talk about what they wanted for Christmas and give them a gift. And it was a way of again, reaching out to the community that was here, as well as the community that we wanted to see come here. Parades were another thing that was done here. There was a movement to restart the Christmas parade that had been downtown for many years, and then as downtown died, the parade went with it. And the goal was to see if we could restore the whole idea of a Christmas parade down here to bring shoppers down to the district. And so the parade was put together. We didn't have the floats. We didn't have a lot of things, but we had the Shriners. And if you remember how the Shriners put the parade in, it was 2 or 3 miles long of all these guys in their red fezzes and doing all sorts of things. So we had the Shriners. We had people dressed up as buildings. And we had a parade. Parade went from railroad tracks on 5th Avenue to Broadway to the waterfront. Did that for a year or so. Horton Plaza opened. Horton Plaza said, the parade, which was a daytime parade, is ruining our business. So the parade then shifted off of Gaslamp to to Broadway. And I'm trying to think of the woman, Peggy Ralph was the executive director at the time, and she was this pushing the parade. But we continued to work, and the Gaslamp Association continued to work at the parade until the Holiday Bowl people took it over and decided that the amateurs were no longer part of the whole process. It moved on. Sorry. The question was, what role did the railroad play with the Gaslamp Quarter? And let's see, my mind is going. The person who, Alonzo Horton.
Yes.
Alonzo Horton built a wharf at the foot of Fifth Avenue. The railroad was coming to San Diego. The main station for at least shipping was located at Fifth Avenue. And that's the role the railroad played. It changed. One of the things that happened was we were going to be the railroad capital of the West Coast. That the railroad was moving from the East Coast west, and the feeling was we had a natural harbor, and that we were going to be the place that became the railroad capital of the West Coast. And the city grew to about 40,000 at the time. That's how all the buildings in the Gaslamp really got built, the major buildings. That the feeling was we were going to be this center of activity. We had to have architecture. We had to have buildings that really represented who we were as a community, or who we were going to become. The city grew to about 40,000, and I may have my numbers wrong. The railroad decided to go to Los Angeles because the route was easier. And the railroad that had come around to San Diego got washed out in floods or some disasters. And so our population dipped to 13,000, I think, almost overnight. And it started growing again, but it was many years before it grew to that size and then on. But the railroad did play a part in how all this came about. I'm sorry, do you have a question? Oh. The house, the William Heath Davis house. We're here tonight because apparently there's a flood in the basement. A regular occurrence. But the house came about because it was we wanted something historic that could be a center for the community. It was one of the last houses left that came around the Horn as a kit. With the invention, I take my students down here because the invention of lumber mills, being able to shape lumber, and the invention of the nail changed the whole building habits, how we build in this country. We went from logs and heavy timber construction to wood frame construction, which is what most things are built with today. And this house was sitting in what is now going to be East Village Green if it ever gets built. And it was, at that time, it was a storage yard for old fire equipment. And the goal was, well, if it's going to be torn down, they offered it to the Gaslamp Quarter. And Tom Hom and others Tom, I think, owned the property where the house is right now, said they'd take it off their hands, and we moved it down here. It was an interesting place because when it was up on 13th Street, it had no electricity. It had some gas. It also had a lot of extension cords that ran to other buildings because the important thing was to have the TV working, and you can't run a TV with electricity. But we moved the house down here, and the decision was made, let's put a basement in because we wanted to have more space, a space for meetings and for other things to take place. And so the basement went in. And the basement regularly flooded. And I don't know what the response was this most recent time, but the city said the reason it was flooding is all these restaurants would go in, and they didn't have adequate plumbing, and their grease traps would collect, and it would force all the water to the lowest point, all the, not clean water, all the stuff, and the lowest point was the basement of the Gaslamp Quarter house because land slopes and we were below grade. And so it was almost, there was a company that I don't know if it's the same one that does the maintenance, cleaning, they were almost had their truck parked in front of the building all the time because it was something that occurred on a regular basis, and events kept getting canceled and things moved. But it was a regular occurrence. But the house became the center, and the Gaslamp Quarter Park was a place that raising money to do it was having people buy bricks and having their names engraved. And then there's the two dogs in the park, the dog and the dog from Scotland. And there was another interesting, Rosie and I got to go to Scotland because the dog was in the park. And Mayor O'Connor arranged for us to go to visit Edinburgh and to meet with their city architect. And I was the city architect at the time. And the dog was part of it. The dog, and Bum the dog, the reason for really raising the awareness of Bum the dog was Marie Hitchcock, who used to be the puppet lady in Balboa Park. And she had a dog, a puppet dog, that was Bum the dog, the three-legged dog. So all these, things just have a way of connecting here in town. There's lots of other things too that I want to mention. One which isn't really in the Gaslamp Quarter, but it's the Horton Grand Hotel. And the Horton Grand Hotel is two buildings that were threatened with demolition. And I don't know if Dan Pearson talked about that when he was here, but it was another case where the buildings were going to be torn down, and there was a feeling that rather than just throw them in the dump, maybe we could move the Kale Saddlery and the Horton Grand Hotel to a site adjacent to the Gaslamp and restore them. A couple of interesting issues with those. One was the preservation issue. How do you decide what you keep and what you don't when things are historic? The Chinese museum that we're in today, or part of, grew out of something that had to be torn down in order to locate the Kale Saddlery, a crib. And Catalina sent me the map of the old Gaslamp Quarter. But when this was the Stingery, there were these buildings that were located here, and the old insurance maps describe them. They were opium dens, they were houses of prostitution, and the houses of prostitution were called cribs. Rooms, a series of rooms connected that were usually two women. One solicited and the other worked. And there was one that had turned into a residence that was still down here on the corner where the Kale Saddlery was restored. And it was really a lot of discussion about what to save and what not, and what is going to be the best economic generator, what is going to be the best historic representation of the site. What was built was the Horton Grand. It was Dan, I don't know if Dan talked about this either, but Dan, Wayne Donaldson, and I flew back to Washington because we wanted to get the tax credits for the restoration of historic buildings. So we went back and met with the keeper of the National Register. We had done some things. The buildings faced a different direction. The pop-outs where the bay windows were not historic. The keeper of the National Register was my wife's history teacher, architectural history teacher at the University of Illinois. And when we went to make the case for this, he said, no. He said, not only that, I'm going to change your transcripts and fail you in architectural history. He didn't. I mean, it was 25 years later. So, but it's one of those things where, again, trying to decide how historically pure you do something and how you make adjustments to do things perhaps a little differently. I want to pass around two things just to point out some of the things that we did. The Gaslamp Quarter was not everybody's favorite idea of restoration. I used to have, and again I think they're in the basement of the building, a series of articles that were written by some people who later became the biggest boosters of downtown redevelopment, who talked about throwing money down a rat hole and that the city should be ashamed for spending money on a bunch of old buildings in an area that was a red light district. And so every year we had to publish a report for the city council that talked about all the things that were going on down here, all the economic generators that were happening, everything that was going on. And those are two samples of the reports that are floating around. Just a couple of, I mean, there's a lot of people that really made this district happen. Some people were here for the short term, some people were here for longer term, some people were in and out, some people are still involved. But it's that constant working to maintain and to develop the property. You know, and I'll throw out a couple of names that I remember. Chuck Tyson, I don't know if anybody remembers Chuck Tyson. Chuck was a property owner, owned a lot of property up in North County, but property downtown as well. Chuck really pushed, and he was a person that had a lot of leverage. His family was very close to Pete Wilson and to Ronald Reagan. And Chuck moved to Washington and used to call me regularly from the basement of the White House to find out what was happening and why it wasn't happening. We used his clout. His clout really helped move things along. Dan Pearson, who you met, and Kit Goldman, who restored the theaters, and Dan, who was hired by the city to be a project manager for the Gaslamp, really threw their heart into it. And the directors of the association that had been around for different terms, and each one of them added something to the process that really made all this happen. And it really took a feeling of support from a lot of people to really make a district happen. And then there was Al Macy, who was an architect, Tom Hahn. There are a lot of others that are mentioned in this book, and that I think is available in the building. So it's just a continuing process, and then things happen. One day that Monday morning, I got a call very early in the morning from the chairman of the Planning Commission. He had come up Fifth Avenue on his way to work, a lawyer, Lou Wolfsheimer, and he wanted to know what was going on. At the Bekesto building at 5th and Market, there was a 3-story cutout of a woman with the entrance going through her legs to get into the building. And I want to know, how did that happen? Did it have permits? So I got in the car and came down here bright and early and found somebody from the Film Commission. And it was a movie called Scavenger Hunt with George C. Scott about a man who was looking for his daughter who disappeared. In the story I got from the Film Commission, they couldn't find any district that was seedy enough to film in, so they came here. But then, after a few years, they stopped doing that because we no longer had the necessary image for the movies to be made. Marilyn and Gene Marks. Marilyn founded the Gaslamp Gazette. They owned the Lester Hotel on Market and 4th, which is where Wayne Donaldson had his first office. Again, all these people really fed into making this district the success that it is. And I think that everybody who's involved really should be proud of the efforts that they worked on. And I take questions. Thank you.
Can you talk about the borders? How the
Oh, the
borders
board,
of
yeah.
the district were
Yeah.
determined?
There are many different proposals for how the border of the district came about. Ed Scott, who I mentioned earlier, his boundary was maybe Market to Broadway and 5th Avenue to include Balboa Theater, Spreckles Theater, and Horton Plaza and Golden West. When CCDC came around, they really fought that. they were not interested at the time of preserving those buildings, the Spreckles and the Belbo, and so they fought to have the border pushed back to 4th Avenue, and the council went along. One scheme had it going from Market to C Street to pick up a number of the buildings that were on C Street. The merchants were not that happy with people who had businesses there were not that happy with being included in the district. We then looked at the historic buildings that were available, or not available, they're there, that were further down to the south, and decided that maybe we should go all the way down to the railroad tracks. The area between Market and Island on 4th Avenue, in the frontage where the Royal Pie Bakery was, is now many different things. The owners petitioned to be part of that district. Alex Cannell, who was the operator of the Royal Pie Bakery, really pushed to have his property included in the district. And we opted to do that because we had a property owner that was willing to expand the district. There was talk of pushing out in different directions over the years, and it just didn't happen. So the boundaries became fixed at what they are today. I'm sorry, did I answer your question?
Two questions. One, I'm surprised that a lot more buildings didn't get torn down. Can you tell us why we ended up with so many of the historic buildings that didn't get torn down? And then secondly, tell us what your feelings about kind of looking at the Gaslamp today. What are its strengths, weaknesses, problems going forward, advantages?
Okay, the first question that Bill asked was why did so many buildings remain? And I think part of it was, one, the idea that something could happen, that there was potential here. And so people hung on to the buildings, and we designated them historic. And they were hanging on. Some of the owners changed, some things changed. But that helped do it. The other part of it was, and I'm going to go back to the boundaries for a minute, the other part of it was that there wasn't that much need for all that parking. There wasn't a lot of stuff going on down here that you needed to have acres and acres of parking lot. But going back to the question about the boundaries, there was a push by Sandy Inc., which is now, yeah, they proposed that the blocks between 4th and 6th next to the Horton Plaza shopping center be torn down. That they felt that surface parking was going to be needed to service Horton Plaza. Horton Plaza is going through a lot of changes right now. But there was a big fight not to tear those down. And again, it was part of the incentive, part of it was regulation, that people saw the value in something coming there. The whole historic preservation movement was occurring at the same time that this was going on. Marie, Leah, and I were teaching historic preservation at USD.
What about the impact of the historic preservation tax credits that came along right about that time too?
Okay, I'll get that. Let me finish Bill's question, because I do want to comment. We have, this was after my time, so I'm going to say that. There's a lot of buildings that really shouldn't have been built in the Gaslamp Quarter. There's ones that are just west of the house, that with the cartoons, front facades on them to make them look like separate buildings. That never should have got approved. There's a couple of other buildings that really, for whatever reason, nobody was watching or being adamant enough about things that really fit in the district. And it's not that everything has to look alike or look like it's historic, but there is a scale and there's a character and there are materials that really define what the Gaslamp is. I would argue that what was Joe Yamada's building, which is one building up from Island on 5th, really fits the scale. And the building he built behind it on 4th probably fits. But some of those other buildings were really problems, and there were battles. At one point, CCDC thought that what was needed at the corner of where the railroad tracks and Fifth met, was two high-rise towers because they would mark the gateway to Gaslamp. So it's a constant struggle to really do it. Marie asked about the tax credits. Please tell us about the tax.
Well, I had talked to this group about the tax credit, but I think the availability of that money
Oh, yeah.
has a big impact on the preservation of the buildings and what we have today.
Yeah, I think that the tax credits did. And one of the individuals who really pushed that was a man named Jim Schneider, who redeveloped what is now the Keating Hotel. And he was a tax attorney. And he was another one of these people who really promoted a lot of things. One of the things you'll see in the book is the trolley that ran it during the lunch hours, little buses that circled downtown and brought people to Gaslamp for lunch. It's now the Fred service in downtown. Some of these ideas get put away for a while and they come back and somebody rediscovers them and they come out and begin to change things. So it's a continuing growth and change of the community. There was one other thing I was going to say that you reminded me of. Now I forgot.
Gaslamp going forward,
I'm sorry?
Gaslamp going forward, what are the opportunities and the problems?
Well, I think that things will change. And right now we have the theaters that are going through a redevelopment. And then that was a little bit of a cartoony building too. It was in the postmodern era where you sort of did things that looked funny because they were sort of historic in character. But I think it's changing and it will bring people back down here. I think that there's a market for that. The Gaslamp Quarter came about, and one of the other impetuses was when Ernie Hahn, who built Horton Plaza, made 4 demands on the city before he would go forward. One was to build the transit system. One was to build a convention center, one was to build housing downtown, and one was to build revitalize the Gaslamp Quarter. And that gave an impetus to the city council who wanted to see Horton Plaza go forward to put some more funds and some more emphasis on what was happening in the district. The stories just go on, and each one of you is probably of a whole different set of stories that happened here in the district. Any other questions, or then I'll stop. No. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. That was fascinating.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, History Talks is a monthly lecture series. Our next talk will be September 12th on California Palace of the Arts, the magnificent Villa Montezuma. It's going to be given by Louise Torrio, who's here tonight with us, and she is the chair of the Friends of the Villa Montezuma. And it'll be a wonderful talk on one of the most beautiful Victorian buildings in San Diego. So please join us for that. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and once again thank the San Diego Chinese Historic Museum for the use of their wonderful facility here. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. I actually can't leave, can I?
Well, let's get you unhooked here.